So, what is white collar and corporate crime? These are for the readings for part 1 of module 1. Let's start with the story you have on the Volkswagen executives who were indicted for falsifying emission tests. There were issues highlighted in the stories from the readings that really highlight themes that you're going to see throughout the course. First, there is a wide impact of any instance of many white-collar crime incidents. In this case, 11 million engines affected. Potentially large financial settlements. In this case, multi-billion-dollar fines on VW to compensate drivers and regulators. In many cases, white-collar crime may have an international scope, affecting people in multiple nations. And here gets to a key theme. Question of who in the company knew about wrongdoing and who to hold responsible for corporate wrongdoing. In this case, there's the issue of legal extradition of executives to bring to justice in the US. And also, how do you find out about white-collar crime? As in this case, often very important role of outside groups, whistleblowers inside a company, to expose wrongdoing. So what kinds of crimes are covered under the scope of white-collar crime? You have cases we'll read about of Bear Stearns, executives knowingly selling worthless financial derivatives. Student loan companies bribing financial aid officials. Asbestos removal companies faking removal and endangering lives. Employers failing to pay a minimum wage and stealing from their employees. Companies dumping toxic waste in a local river. A medical practice faking health care provided to patients to collect Medicare payments from government they didn't earn. Groups spreading fake information on locations of a polling place to reduce voter turnout and elect politicians who will benefit them financially. Or a large company using its market power to undermine competitors and raise prices for consumers. So what do all these white-collar crimes have in common? Doesn't usually include the typical crimes in the nightly news, especially local news, burglary, murder, car theft. The offenders involved usually, at least at the beginning, have a high level of trust and respectability in society. A trust they in some form betray. And these kinds of crimes, when you hear a politician banging the table around law and order, usually they don't mean these kinds of crimes. Generally, they get lumped in with corporate crime, although messy definitions, and we'll talk about some places where there's differences. In your reading, you'll read about Edwin Sutherland, who in some ways discovered white-collar crime, at least as a sociological category. He introduced the term into literature in 1939. He was very angered by the corruption of big business, this being the Great Depression, where all sorts of, as we'll talk about, like maneuvering and bad deals were seen as having caused the collapse of the economy. Criminological theories up to that point had only tried to explain the behavior of lower-class criminals, and Sutherland wanted to address that. He was elected to head the American Sociological Society and used that platform to promote the idea and encourage research and investigation into the area of white-collar crime. Others before had obviously inveighed against the crimes of the rich, whether Marx, the muckrakers, others as well, but Sutherland tried to incorporate it into a broader social theory more systematically. But to take a quote from somebody a few decades before Sutherland, A.E. Ross had written, "The man who picks pockets with a railway rebate, murders with an adulterant instead of a bludgeon, burglarizes with a rake-off instead of a jimmy, cheats with a company prospectus instead of a deck of cards, or scuttles his town instead of his ship, does not feel on his brow the brand of a malefactor." This goes to the idea that folks committing many of these white-collar crimes were not treated as criminals in any sort of media or often within the criminal justice system itself, and that's what was often being demanded to address. Okay, so how did Sutherland define white-collar crime? The key part is violation of a delegated or implied trust, i.e., you were given some responsibility because of your status, and you in some ways betrayed that. He argued for recognizing this as a crime, even if in many cases punishment was not always prison, whether a financial or other punishment short of going to prison. He noted that white-collar classes had extra influence on shaping the laws that actually protected them and often defined the law as their acts not being crimes, even if many in the public would define it that way. His 1949 book would note that most charges against corporations were non-criminal, even when the harm might be seen as broader, often more dangerous, sometimes causing more death than many of the categories of crime that deserved a prison sentence or other what was seen as criminal sanction. He compared white-collar criminals to organized crime. The difference being, compared to much crime, that organized crime, like white-collar crime, was often rational and persistent, meaning happening over time, not as just one discrete act. Here's the limits of Sutherland's approach in many people's view. Sutherland, in many ways, overemphasized an individualistic framework. He looked at social, psychological factors far more than talking about the systematic constraints and influences that might lead a whole organization like a corporation to take malevolent action towards the public out of self-interest or out of the imperatives of the economy within which they were. So he largely ignored those social structural factors, such as overall capitalism, the business cycles that might cause a bubble or then a recession, and the broader political economy that really set the terms for why firms had the power they have in the first place. Following Sutherland, a couple decades later, a new energy around white-collar crime followed social movements that rose in the 1970s, targeting white-collar crime. Part of it was disillusionment with the institutional leaders from the Vietnam War, and much of the same energy, some of the same individuals turned to those with trust within the economic, corporate world, looking at the crimes that they were doing and the trust they were seen as betraying. Civil rights movement fed directly into many folks in the consumer and environmental rights movements in the 1970s. There was also within academy what was often called neo-Marxist conflict theories, directed more attention to the crimes of economic elites. Politicians stepped forward to ride the energy and the demands from the public to pursue new laws and indictments that would raise their own public profile while challenging some of the problems and acts that these corporations had not been challenged on before. But the reality was some good laws passed, some good indictments, people held to account, but overall little consistency in pursuit of white-collar crime over the decades. And when the war on terror came post 9/11, it was actually even harder to keep a focus of the justice system on white-collar crime, with so many resources taken towards addressing terrorism and other crimes across the federal government. And then there's the media images of white-collar crime. Most emphasis on crime in the media is usually on violent crime. And just that focus on violence means that you often avoid the structural or political sources of crime. You know, people dying in a corporate situation are usually labeled an accident, not crimes. You know, people in an unsafe environment at work, slipping, falling, that's an accident, except if that was negligent, if there were warnings and were not addressed, that is treated as a crime under the law, but usually not how it's portrayed. And when indictments come, the focus is usually on a few individuals, not a corporation as a whole as the source of the crime. And even when the indictments come, except in some special circumstances, most are not the top story on the news, even if it might get covered later in the broadcast or buried inside on the business page. There's just less interest and, frankly, a lot of corporate pressure on the media not to cover many of these stories. And to be honest, much of it is not great visual images for television. You know, a lawyer in their office, corporate head signing papers, just doesn't have the high drama to give you the pictures you want. So there are some understandable reasons why it doesn't get the same media coverage, but the result is, however pervasive white collar crime might be, it just isn't there in the public consciousness in the same way. Okay, so given these constraints, economic, political, media, how does white collar crime usually get exposed? Often, and we'll see it throughout the course, there were informers or whistleblowers from within an organization in many of the cases where white collar crime comes to the public attention and to the attention of prosecutors. You know, in history, political cartoons actually were probably the source of media often ridiculing the elite in the most systematic way, just because a quick panel, you have an individual who often wants to be brought down a peg. And then you have the social movement organizations that systematically are trying to target corporations as a whole, in sectors as a whole, and they'll pursue and expose targets based on that agenda. You know, a classic example was Ralph Nader, as a key figure in the 1970s, who was really part of the rise of the consumer movement, using in that research as a key tool to actually expose the systematic parts of corporate and white collar actions that were harming the public. And workers inside firms are often exposed to toxics and wrongdoing. Labor unions often are forced for exposing financial and other crimes during organizing campaigns where they're actually targeting a company. And you also do have a number of social societies, community organizations that actually themselves target and expose wrongdoing. You know, and you do have political institutions, Congress, state legislators, city councils that hold hearings and actually demand information to expose some of this wrongdoing. Once many of these other groups act, that's often when prosecutors or attorneys generals come in to actually make the prosecution. So this is how the rest of the course will go. This week, we're exploring the historical and legal differences between white collar and quote-unquote traditional crime. Second week, we'll look at theories of who commits white collar crime, individuals or collective corporate organizations, and why they do it. Third week, we'll evaluate crimes by corporations against stakeholders in those firms, whether shareholders or employees. And the fourth week, we'll explore the crimes by corporations against the public, whether through environmental damage, unsafe conditions or products, or consumer fraud. Then the next week, we'll look at crimes against the government and the democratic process. Then we'll take a step back, look at places where the victims of the crime is the economy as a whole, and whether that's through antitrust violations or the financial crisis that we suffered a decade ago. And finally, we'll discuss why in a global economy it's so hard to hold white-collar criminals accountable and look at what options are available. Look forward to the session together.